Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I'll give a short introduction about the research, and then I have a short film to show and a PowerPoint. So, and I think I'll do questions at the end. So I started this research for a few different reasons. I started about a few years ago creating a course on how to teach about the Holocaust. So rather than a chronological history, I sort of looked for good teaching moments, if I can use that expression. And I started creating basically case studies. And while I was doing that, I also, my mother is a Holocaust survivor, and I started being more involved in some of her work. She's written a number of books, and she's a historian. She has a doctorate from NYU in history. And she was one of the very early ones to do history of the Holocaust in the 70s. And I started to, I used to edit her work, but I started just in the last 10 years to accompany her to all kinds of memorial events because of her age. And my father had passed away, so I became the person to do that. And then I realized there were so many educational components of what she was doing. And especially in Germany, many teachers engage in Holocaust commemoration. It's just amazing. They engage in it within the school system and outside the school system. They become sort of, I don't want to say obsessed, but they really take on a project beyond what's necessary in the school system. So what I'm going to talk about today really is connected to one such teacher. She was a guide at the, she was a teacher and a guide at the Dachau concentration camp. And she was told one day that there was a displaced persons camp for children in a convent very close to where she lived. And she was amazed. She had never heard about it. So she started researching that, and she ended up writing a book and having some museum exhibits about that. I became involved with her because my mother was one of the orphans at the convent, and I will talk about that afterwards. I really was amazed at her work, and I became involved in some of the process of creating the museum exhibits. And I'm involved with a few different museums. So this is not the Buchenwald Memorial. This is the Kloster Indistor. So I think now, if it's okay, I'll start showing the film, which explains there have been a number of museum exhibits and films made about this displaced persons camp. And I picked one that was done with the collaboration of a nearby school, which I will also talk about afterwards. So if it's okay, I'll go ahead and share the screen for the, for the film. So let me see if I can just, okay. Okay, let me figure out how to. Okay. Okay, can you see this? Did it start?
Yes, it did.
Okay, wonderful.
Our first night in Germany we spent in Dachau, which was a terrible shock to all of us.
Indersdorf was like an island after I was shipwrecked.
Immediately after the Second World War, in July 1945, the UN organization UNRWA set up the first refuge for the youngest victims of National Socialism in Kloster Indersdorf near Dachau. UN volunteer Greta Fischer remembers.
The will to survive blocked out absolutely everything. The will to survive and the rage to live blocked out absolutely everything.
She and the entire UN team cared for hundreds of unaccompanied children like this child survivor.
I was in the concentration camp Flossenburg. I was liberated and the Americans brought me to Indersdorf, Kloster Indersdorf.
Orphan Jewish survivors of concentration camps like Sacha, Imra, Laza, and Martin, babies found in complete neglect, like Gisela, Walter, and Daniel. Hundreds of Jewish and Gentile teenagers who had experienced the unimaginable. Stan had to do slave labor in Berlin, while the Polish siblings lost their parents as forced laborers in Bavaria, orphaned and all alone in a hostile country. 70 years later, they exchange memories of their first steps back to life.
The first thing was to give them food, to give them clothing, which was difficult, food, plenty of food, and listen to their stories. And we listened to their stories days, nights. It had to come out. It had to come out. And sometimes it would take hours, to sit with them because you could not interrupt. We also were very conscious to write down their stories. Each had terrible story to tell, terrible story. Their suffering, their separation of their parents, of their small sisters and brothers.
The UNRWA team wanted to create a therapeutic environment, physical care, a hot bath, medical treatment, a clean bed of one's own, and food.
We wanted to give the children as normal life as possible.
Above all, caring, reliable, and dedicated personal relations proved to be the most important factor in regaining a feeling of security and trust in the world.
And we had knives and forks, and we discussed amongst ourselves what kind of life would the children have if their parents would be alive.
The UN volunteers lived with the children, had to be mother, father, teacher, doctor, cook, and friend to these severely traumatized young people. To satisfy their physical needs to the fullest, family-like groups. And listen to them retell the horrors branded by the Nazis on their souls. What had each of these youngsters already gone through?
Sons and daughters of the slave workers of the Hitler regime, they have become identifiable only by a number branded by the Nazis on their arms.
The tattoo KL for Konzentrationslager is still visible 70 years later.
In the camps, it was willpower.
Yeah.
It was only willpower. It wasn't saying, I wanted to survive and tell the world what they've done to us.
It seemed as if something burned inside them, an intense rage to live. It had helped them go through all the dangers and finally to survive.
One thing which was amazing too is the remembrance, the good things we knew and we know today, that the very early years of children are terribly important. And I very strongly believe that those children who had the early good years, they were stronger than some of the others.
Their first relations, their first experiences that they were special to others had given them support in the camps. Now their burning desire was to find family members who might have survived. Many went home on their own.
We became very restless and we became very anxious. We were very anxious to let them go, but there was no way of keeping them, absolutely no way of keeping them. So we would give them papers with a lot of stamps. You know, there were different countries, there were different zones. There were the American zone, the French zone, and the British zones, and the Russian zones. And the Russian zones were the zone which was more difficult to, so we gave them big stamps on the papers to facilitate. We gave them food. Sometimes there was tremendous reunions, but there was a lot of heartache too, because so many didn't find anybody.
The heartache of being all alone in the world.
I did have nobody, you know, from, we were 10 people with my parents, and I'm the survivor. I had nobody left, and I felt like I've got home now. You know, I'm you know, that they want me. You know, thinking nobody wants you. They only want you to live. You know, this was very emotional to me.
Kloster Indersdorf became a home where the survivors could be children again, a home on a UN island inside Germany, a home in transition. Gentile survivors could be repatriated to their home countries. Where could the Jewish survivors go?
They wanted to get out of Germany. As we said, many wanted to go to America, but America, only a very few could go because there were quotas. Each country had a quota to come to America. The world was absolutely closed. And in everybody's mind, the question always was, where can we go?
In the end, solutions had to be found. Greta Fischer stayed in touch with many and admired their resilience despite severe traumatization.
They still have the feeling they can weather any difficulties. I think they have this feeling of that they're quite powerful, that they can go without food for days, they can do anything they like. They have a lot of confidence in themselves, and I think they have proven some of their confidence by being so energetic that they did extremely well in all their ventures. Many became professional people, many went into business, into building and all kinds, and they were very, very successful. Now, when we talk about their personal happiness, maybe they're not so communicative.
It never leaves them, what was branded by the Nazis on their souls. The survivors who returned to Kloster Indersdorf 70 years later have mastered their lives so far. First, they talk about their suffering and loss, but also about their lives before and after the Holocaust. They are living proof of how a team of UN volunteers was able to work for the benefit of young Holocaust survivors. They serve as a model for caring for traumatized children today.
Okay. I'm going to start with the PowerPoint now. And I visited in 2017. This film was made 2014. So I'm not, my mother wasn't in this reunion, but I'll go through the PowerPoint and we can hopefully unpack a little bit about the history.
Good, thank you.
Okay, let me just figure out how to.
That was powerful, by the way.
Oh yeah, it's amazing that the story was not known before really Anna started researching it, and then Greta Fisher, the main UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency worker, she left a written record. She went on to become an academic, and she left reports that because of the reports, you know, we could then look at the history of it. And then Anna decided she was going to track down the orphans like 70 years later. Like, who does that? You know, and she started sending postcards. She found a list. And so I'll talk about her. Let me go through the PowerPoint.
Right.
Miriam,
Yes.
was a powerful, that was a wonderful view. Well, as you're preparing the PowerPoint and as you're thinking while we're watching that, the thought that occurs to me are that's a wonderful story of the strong and courageous who survived. What about the ones who survived but didn't, but their lives were not as beautiful as these lives? What, you know, and it would be interesting to know.
Yeah, that's
a small slice of the group.
right.
Just pretty reflective of the group.
Right. Well, Greta Fisher already refers to it, that working hard and achieving some level of financial security didn't mean that your inner world was repaired. And I will, I'm doing this presentation from a historical viewpoint, but I have been involved with some psychological groups and intergenerational trauma, and you know, a lot of that. So there's definitely a difference. And one thing in the literature that's come up is that even events such as weddings, bar mitzvahs, they were triggers for PTSD symptoms that you didn't expect. You know, it would, because family members were no longer there, or because the orphans remembered that they didn't have a bar mitzvah or, a wedding or any kind of a family occasion, depending how early, they were caught up in the war. So those became triggers for a lot of emotional disturbance. And as I said, some of the, I'm not going to present it here, but I'll just answer this question kind of to that point. Some of the psychological analysis looked at the fact that some of these orphans as adults functioned with PTSD symptoms that were quite strong, but they didn't become psychotic. They were able to function in society. In terms of the impact on their children, that's another story. There's a lot of there is a literature for the second generation in terms of how these survivors were able to function as parents, and there's some recognizable dysfunctions that come up in the literature. So there's a lot that, this film is made, from the perspective of, let's see what happened after the war and how you can overcome trauma. And I'll discuss that more as I go through in terms of what the lessons are for the local German community, if I can put it that way, after I go through the PowerPoint and explain a little bit more, if that's okay. Okay, let me go ahead and, okay, let me share screen. Let's just see if I did that. Okay, let me do new share. Okay. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am, it's up.
Okay, let me do play from current slide. Okay, play from current slide. Can you see the,
Yep.
Is it up? Okay, wonderful.
Good to go.
Okay, so I'll be very happy to take more questions. Let me go through this a little bit so you can get some of the history behind the film. Okay, so I will get back to this picture. This, though, is my mother, and this is her sister, as they were part of the orphans at the convent. And they actually, the convent opened as a displaced persons camp in the summer of 1945. My mother and her sister, here's my mother and here's her sister, they arrived in 1946, early 1946. My mother was actually hospitalized for a number of months right after she was liberated. She escaped actually from a death march, but she had been in 3 concentration camps, and she was a slave laborer. And she was not well enough to go to a DP camp. She was in a hospital, and she arrived, as I said, in 1946, early 1946, and she stayed for about a year. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as I go through. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what you just saw. Sometimes I was thinking perhaps to show the film afterwards, but I decided to show it earlier. So hopefully it'll work that way, but I have some references in my PowerPoint as to, we'll see the film, but we saw it already. But anyway, so what this case study and some of the museum exhibits about it have shown is there's been a lot of documentation of what happened in the camps, as far as we can understand from historical accounts and survivor testimonies. What is starting to become of interest is how did people rebuild their lives? So the life after, and especially in terms of the orphans, there were a number of very progressive educational theories that were put to work in terms of how these DP camps were run. And this was very, very different from the adult DP camps. There's an excellent film called The Children of Windermere, which was a similar children's DP camp set up in England in the Lake District. And that also focuses on the educators and how they try to deal with the severely traumatized children. And another interest is what can we take away from what these educators and psychologists and social workers were experimenting with in some ways. What can we learn for traumatized populations today? So the DP camp was opened in a 12th century monastery, and it was located near Dachau in the American zone of Germany. Oh, this is a picture of the convent, which you saw in the film. And it was part of the Munich district of the US zone of occupation. And it is the first camp that was established just for children and teens in the immediate post-war period, summer of 1945. The nuns who had been in the convent were the Sisters of Mercy of St. Vincent de Paul. There's a lot about their work in the convent that Anna has researched, and they left during World War II. They were not in the convent, and they came back to work under the supervision of the United Nations personnel, UNRWA Team 182, of which Greta Fischer left a written record. What's interesting is that they were there to help the UNRWA workers. So and the nuns left also records about what they thought. They were very surprised by the anti-authoritarian, progressive, child-centered approaches that the progressive educators said were extremely important. Specifically, orphans who had survived World War II were extremely they never trusted authority. They were extremely suspicious of anyone in an authoritarian figure, whether it's physicians. People were, physicians in the camps were not there really to administer medicine. Whatever the position was, they were extremely mistrustful, and they didn't accept them. So anything that involved accepting authority had to be done very carefully. Anna Anlauer talked about some of this tension between the nuns and the progressive educators in her book about Kloster Indesdorf. Came out in 2012. She's had updated versions. And as I said, it opened in the summer of 1945, and it was located in the former Augustinian convent. And the children ranged in age from infancy to the early 20s. They typically had a few hundred children there. The sisters were considered very loyal and hardworking, and there were one reason that the convent was considered a good place for a DP camp was it had its own farm, so you could grow food, which was an issue, to get in terms of rationing, and it had grounds that were somewhat self-contained, so they could have children do sports and different activities within the grounds and not have to worry about their facing the local population outside the grounds. And in any case, the sisters were mentioned in their records, as I said, that the children were extremely wild. And the fact that the educators decided that they couldn't take an authoritarian approach, no matter what. So they emphasized children involved in democratic learning activities. So if they didn't like some of the rules, they were allowed to protest. They were allowed to have petitions, and their thoughts were listened to as much as possible. For example, Ann Lauer notes in her book that they had an issue with unauthorized people coming into the camp, and they wanted to do a type of counting of how many, children were there each evening. And when they attempted to do that, there were a group of boys who still had their concentration camp uniforms. They pulled them out and they started to recreate the appel, roll call, which was a very infamous feature of camp life where you had to stand and be counted, and it was used as a punishment. So you could stand for hours and hours in the snow in your thin uniform, and they just counted you. And if anyone was missing, then whether they tried to escape or whatever it was, they would just leave the people there on roll call until they figured out what had happened. And so they recreated this roll call, and then they even recreated somebody who would shoot you randomly. So they showed that you can't count us. You can't use any of the methods that were used within the camp, even if you just want to, cut down on strangers coming in. We won't tolerate it. And they understood that. The UNRWA staff understood that they have to come up with another way of, they can't line them up and count them because it triggers what they had gone through in the camp. So they have to come up with another way of counting them. But the nuns thought they were crazy. Another issue of tension that, and there are a number, many of these documented also in the Windermere film, goes through a number of these triggers and how educators try to deal with them. For example, they had an UNRWA employee transferred to another camp. Now, they lived on site, most of the UNRWA employees. So the teens had become very attached to one of the employees. This was not Greta Fisher. She stayed there. This was someone else, Helen Steger. And she, when they realized she had been transferred, they actually submitted a petition to UNRWA headquarters that they should return this worker. And they actually wrote, they have these petitions were saved. They said, we've become attached to her as if she was a mother figure. How can you take her away from us? As if she was our mother. And they returned her. They understood that, we have to listen to what the teens are saying, what they need. And people noticed that the nuns, while they didn't necessarily agree with some of these decisions that the UNRWA workers made, they needed so much help with the labor. They had to do so much work for the teens with so many children coming and going, that they appreciated that they always were there to provide the care, whether they agreed with the progressive philosophy or not. And that did come through. Initially, children of all ages were accepted, brought there. They came, either they just arrived or they were brought there by some of the US forces. And there was a mixture of children who had come, who were children of forced laborers. So the Germans were able to take people from many of the countries that they occupied and just bring them in to work in factories. So there was a mixture, and then they would have children that either had been fathered by Germans, or just they were forced laborers that had children and the parents had disappeared. And these were some of the children who showed up. And then the Jewish teens who had survived concentration camps or hiding. For the most part, you did not have Jewish babies or young children. They were older who had been involved in the slave labor. And most of the non-Jewish children were able to be repatriated. Somebody, once they had to figure out what their identifying details were, but they were able to go back to their countries. That was not the case for the Jewish teens, who in most their homes, and whether in Hungary, Poland, they were taken over. So they really, and as orphans, they had nobody to advocate for them. This is a picture again of the convent. And this is Anna Anlauer saying that while the Holocaust was never treatable, it was very important for immediately after liberation to provide something for children to some semblance of normality, to sort of relearn what are the what is going to be expected of you. And the Children of Windermere film that documents what happened in another camp, and Anna was actually involved with that, that really shows some of the tensions where some of the educators said to the children, you know, you suffered a lot, but once you leave here, you have to go work or go to school or whatever it is you're going to do, and people will not give you sympathy because of what happened to you. You're going to have to go out on your own terms and make a life for yourself. So whereas there were many children, especially they were in the DP camps, as word began, as they understood, they began to understand that nobody was left in their families. Many of them didn't necessarily know that or accept that immediately upon liberation. And that was part of the work that the educators had to do with them, was to process the fact that you are the only one alive. You know, maybe they saw their mother killed, their father killed. They hoped an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, somebody would still be alive. And that work had to, the Red Cross issued documents sort of tracing as much as they could what had happened. And that was, for the most part, while they were in the DP camps, that work had to be done. And that's where they finally had to acknowledge that. And child survivors say they had been shipwrecked. In the film, they said it was like we were, one of the survivors, Tibor, says we had been, it was if we had been shipwrecked and Indesdorf was an island that we were now trying to achieve security on. And Elie Wiesel wrote a letter in the 1980s. He was a survivor of Buchenwald, a teen survivor. And he said that initially survivors of Buchenwald had nothing to say to the living. Europe and the world celebrated the victory over Hitler's Germany and its accomplices without us. Walled into the solitude of a childhood that had been mutilated, stolen, jeered at, we wanted to live apart. We didn't want any of your help or your understanding or your psychological tests or your charity. With a little time, however, we found ourselves on the same side, he recalled. To what do we owe that miracle? How can it be explained? So how could you have taken these children who had so much potential for violence and brought them to a place where they could enter a society again? And that's what the Greta Fisher talks about. So I'm presenting a little bit of some of the literature around the educators, the displaced persons camps. One of them, these are mostly historians. There are many psychological studies. Being a historian myself, I'm aware of some of them, but I'm focused on this presentation in the terms of the historians. So one of them, Daniela Doron, she followed the post-war struggle over children in France. And there she said that children had become the public face of what was left after the war. And children in particular, Hitler wanted to exterminate the Jewish race, and particularly children weren't accidental victims of the war. They were part of the policy of genocide. And therefore, rehabilitating orphans, teens, for the most part after the war, was a key part of Jewish agencies. And she's done research on an agency, OSE, who has also left records in terms of what their approaches were. While, as I mentioned, right after the war, that's when, for the most part, children started to understand that nothing was going to be the same. So I know my mother talked about it as well. People, as long as they were in the concentration camps, they thought, okay, we're going to be liberated, or it's going to end, and then we're going to go back to life as it was before. And, you know, that was kind of the image that sustained them. We're going to go back to our house and, you know, have our life as if it had never been interrupted by the war. And that, that just, that became, that dream, it was understood in the DP camps that as they started to search for people or go back to their homes, that they could not go back. The homes were occupied and the people never came back. So that was something that they had to deal with in terms of the educators had to deal with. What I couldn't cover in this presentation, which I'm going to go through a little bit quicker, I'm realizing I'm running out of time, was the actual classes depended on, they had many different languages. So it depended on who they could get. They hired displaced persons from the adult camps who were educators to come in and teach particular classes, including vocational training. There was a huge emphasis on different classes in different languages, whoever they could find, and vocational training. And as Greta Fisher talked about, there was a lot of thinking about, where these children would have been if the war had not happened. And this was part of what the educators tried to understand as they dealt with the children. This is a map, I'll go through it real quick, of the DP camps after the war. There were different zones. Indesdorf is right here. Since it was a children's camp, it doesn't appear on this, but it's right near Munich. I have to emphasize how different the children's camp was from the adult camps. The adult camps, they just barely could get food out to the survivors. They couldn't do very much in terms of rehabilitation. It was very different in the children's camps, but this is where Indesdorf was, and this is the American zone within Germany. There's a lot of discussion of how trauma began to be understood in terms of World War II. And one definition of the history of trauma that I found is that it came to a public notice in Britain in the 1860s and 1870s as a way to describe symptoms afflicting early railroad travelers. So trauma is very much associated with displacement. And I haven't seen that definition of trauma, but I think it fits in terms of the Holocaust because, of course, the trains took you away from your home. So I feel like that's a fitting definition. So let's start going quicker. What the educators kind of talked about is the thought of a psychological Marshall Plan and how to rebuild children, teens who had suffered. And the documentation of both Greta Fisher and some of the educators in the Windermere camp, there were a handful of these children camps, really not very many. Many adult displaced persons camps, totally different situation. So the therapeutic environment that they talked about, the psychological Marshall Plan, included listening to the life stories of the orphans and providing early documentation. And that was something that once they left the displaced persons camp, people did not want them to talk, especially the children. If they were adopted, which I'll talk about, they were really told as a educational policy, just forget what you went through and continue forward and don't look backwards. So the attempt to hear what had happened to them, and in the summer of 1945, through 1946, it was still fresh. That was somewhat unusual. And to take down the records of what had happened to them, that was also something that they were not able to do in other centers. Listening was followed by food, and we saw that in the film. The decision was made by the UNRWA employees dealing with these in these children camps, again, not in the adult camps, that since they would not fight with children who would take away food. They were just not going to go there. They would allow children to take as much food as they needed to back to their rooms, even if it was they're going to have it because they realize they think they're never going to have another meal. We know we're going to have a meal for them tomorrow. And it was a very high percentage of the budget went to this providing unlimited food, but they said, we are not going to fight with them over food they put in their pockets. Again, this did not happen in the adult DP camps. And the nuns also write about, why are they letting them do this? But this was considered a policy to gain the trust of the children, that they would have trust that there's food tomorrow. And even if they take it away with them, we're not going to run after them and search them and take it out. We're not going to do that. So that was a decision taken that had a economic cost. The next thing they also created, we saw this in the film, tables where they could sit, family style situations. Clothing that was not easy to get. Anna mentions that Greta Fischer once raided, she went out by herself to find clothing material for the children. And she once used material that apparently had made Nazi flags to create clothing, which is in Greta's book. Also, they allowed teens to stay who they want to be with. They got to choose. So they weren't telling them, we're putting you in a room with so-and-so. You decided who you wanted to be in the room with you. They did not separate families, even if they were self-identified families, meaning if there were a brother and sister who they said, this person is like my brother, because we survived two brothers camp families, as they were called, they didn't separate them. They also used art and performance therapy very early on, in which scenes of the camps were recreated. And this is mentioned in the records that they were, just very, very graphic scenes, but they gave children space in which to do that. I mentioned Anna, and her work has been exhibited in, I'll go through this quickly, in different places. And she decided that she was going to find as many children from Indesdorf as she could. And when I met her, and when I visited in 2017, she had already found 50. Since then, the number has gone up, and she's been involved even in some more documentaries about some of the individual survivors have made documentaries about their lives, and she's and the influence, the impact of the educators at Indesdorf. This is a picture from one of the reunions within the convent. And this is where she really brought to light the role of Greta Fischer. Greta Fischer, I'll start to hurry through, had been influenced by Anna Freud. And I visited the Anna Freud house in England, and Greta Fischer spent the war in England, and she first became aware of Anna Freud's theories, which I'll go through quickly. Anna Freud talked about the importance of the early years and the importance of the family. And Fischer also took from Anna Freud this idea of let the children talk about their lives pre-war. So not just what had happened in the camps, but tell us what your life was before the war. And this is something in the film. She said we wanted to imagine what their lives would have been. And this again, this kind of deep listening did not happen outside of the children DP camps. This just was not, there was not space for this. She believes, Greta Fischer in her record said she believes because they let them recall both the good memories and the atrocities, it lowered the risk of suicides. That I don't know if that's her assessment. Okay, so I'm starting to run out of time, but some of the issues that I found in the history of—
Miriam, don't get too worried. If people slip out, if they slip off, that's fine. And people do tightly schedule on Friday, so I know that we will start losing people, but you continue. I'll stay with you until the end.
All right. Okay. So part of the history that I found while researching Anna's work and some of the other historians is that the idea of what is better for the children. Should they be in a communal setting or in a family setting? And that became, the big question. Anna Freud, for example, was very much against any kind of state intervention in the family and leave children in the family setting as much as possible. And as I mentioned, Fisher met Anna Freud when she was in England. She escaped herself from Czechoslovakia, so she had a lot, and her parents were murdered. She and her siblings escaped before the war, but her parents who stayed there were murdered and by the Nazis. And I would imagine that this made her very empathetic to the plight of the orphans, because she herself, was much older, but was orphaned by the war. So Anna Freud, and I'll just talk about this slide for a minute. There are a number of UNRWA workers who also left records who worked with Greta Fisher. And I found one who has an unpublished memoir that I've been going through also for my research. And she says that Greta Fisher not only had a lot of empathy, but she was the type that wouldn't take no for an answer. So, if we didn't have enough money, for clothing, she's going to go out and find fabric somewhere and bring it back. So she was somebody who could bypass bureaucratic regulations to help the teens. And again, she also lived on site and formed very strong attachments to the teens. Okay, so Anna Freud had specifically talked about the issue of children who were traumatized by separation. And that's something that from their family. So in some ways, the moment of separation from the families was considered more damaging psychologically than the bombings and the starvation. That's part of the theories that surrounded some of the philosophies about trauma at the time. And that's something that I've seen also in my contact with some of the survivors, is that last meeting with the parent, the last look before they're separated. That is something that they bring up more than any other element of the war experience. And I don't know if anyone watches Foyle's War on public TV, but they had it's about World War II from the perspective of a policeman in England, and they have an episode where they took children away from their parents to escape the London Blitz, and a child is murdered by a corrupt judge. And the whole episode kind of shows the reluctance of the parents of the child to separate from the child, even if it was to save them from the Blitz. So there's a kind of reference with what Anna Freud had talked about. Okay, let me try to go a little bit further. So as I mentioned, listening to the children's stories, this was something also Anna Freud had talked about, documenting what the children are saying. It was not a simple thing, because children had very, very, they had gone through instances where they changed their birthday, they changed their names, it was very hard to kind of sit down and get like a chronological order. Now, another thing, back to what we had talked about in the beginning, perhaps, was, let me just go back, that the fact that the children were, just go back. I'm not going to have enough time. The fact that the children were looked better because they could recover physically didn't mean that psychologically they were recovered. And that was an issue with teen survivors, that people said, oh, well, a year later you look better. that means you're healed, and they really weren't. Adults had a different, adults I think bore the physical impact of what they had suffered longer, and they didn't have that issue. Okay, I have some statistics. Let me see. All right, I'm almost out of time. Okay, they decided at some point to take pictures of the children, and this is what and these pictures survived. I have a connection to that because there was a social worker at the camp, Andre Marks, who took the pictures with them. These were pictures where they hoped that they would take each child, have their name, and somebody somewhere would see them, and they would have family members come to claim them. As it turns out, it happened very, in very rare cases, but as they started to understand more and more that there were no other survivors. But this was an attempt for the children to reach out for parents to claim them. And as I mentioned, there was a social worker, Andre Marks, who took some of these pictures with him, came to America, and then left it for his son, who lived in Brooklyn. And then his son donated a box of these pictures to a high school in Brooklyn that happened to have it was a private high school, a Jewish day school. And they were one of the first to establish a center for oral histories of the Holocaust in the 70s. And I went to that high school. So it was kind of weird when I realized that these pictures had been donated to the Holocaust Center in the high school that I went to, which later on donated them to a museum. So let's see, let me hurry up. Okay, I'm gonna kind of go through these real quickly. This guy, Tibor Munkachi, who we saw in the film, he ends up he's the one who says that Indesdorf was like an island after he'd been shipwrecked. He ends up being one of the very few children to be adopted by a family member, and he ends up becoming a filmmaker, and he worked on the set of The Godfather and some other films in America, and he just died actually recently. I met him in 2017. Okay, let me go through this. Okay, I'm just gonna. Okay, so one of the issues was that I'll probably end with this was whether the children should be, what would be better for the children? Should they be adopted, or should they continue in some kind of a collective format that gave them some level of autonomy, such as choosing who they could room with, choosing what they could do, that they tried to create in the children's DP camps? What would be better for them? And there were educators such as Ernst Papanek, who said that because they had been persecuted as Jews, they need to recreate their identity in a collective Jewish educational setting. And Papanek really fought with social workers who said, no, they just need to be adopted and move on from what happened. We don't want them to focus on their experience. They need to go forward. And he said, no, the children were they were the face of what Hitler wanted to erase. And therefore you can't expect them, having been the target of so much hatred, to just continue as if nothing had happened. And he really pushed for, and he ran some children's homes during the early part of the war, and that became the big debate. And I'll go on from here. And there were echoes of Janos Korczak, the famous, he ran an orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay, I'll finish here. This is one of the collective groups that decided that they would continue with children as a group and providing them a communal framework rather than looking for individual families to adopt them. And this is my mother, this is her sister, and they were part of a communal group, and they were never adopted. And this is my mother while she was at Indesdorf. And this is her as a child, just before the war, 1940. This is from one of her books, so this is myself. And she says, so she, I'll go quickly through this. She says, I don't know if I could have continued if I was adopted by a family and had to call someone else mother and father. She said that psychologically, no one could replace our parents, and it was better not to try. It was better to be, she was in a few different group situations, collective situations funded by both Jewish organizations and UNRWA. And she said that it was better that we were all sort of equal. We didn't have parents, and nobody was trying to take their place. And she said she knew people that had been adopted, and it was a disaster. It really, the people who adopted the orphans didn't understand what they had been through, and the orphans didn't appreciate being put in a setting where they had to call someone else mother and father. Okay, I think let me take some questions. I'll finish with that, even though, oh, you know what? I'll go a few more slides. Okay, this is the plaque outside that that memorializes outside the convent, that if you visit, you would see. And then I'll just finish with this. As a result of Anna's work, there was a school in the area that was so impressed by Greta Fischer's progressive philosophies that they changed their name to the Greta Fischer Schule. And they are involved in they made the film, and I've been somewhat involved in how they're commemorating this story. Okay, questions, if anyone's left, sorry to go.
Wow, thank you, that was wonderful. I just want to, say thank you very much. This history is so rich, and your knowledge is so deep, and the time, just got away from us. But I will say there are so many links that I pulled out, and I kind of put some of them in the chat. But the dignity, the restorative care and giving the children back their dignity. But even as they progressed and became successful or resilient, in life, they said that those scars never go away. And that's just, I think, as we experience all of the harm to humanity, that is the one thing that I continue to hear in all ethnicities, that the reality of that pain, that trauma, it becomes part of you, of who you are, no matter the circumstances, no matter what you're able to do following. So thank you so very much, Miriam. I don't know, there's only a couple people left, but if there's someone that stayed and has a burning question, please bring it forward. Otherwise, we'll part and have you come back again another time. Is there anyone, Brinson or Terry or Roger, is there anything that you wanted to add?
This is Terry. I was kind of curious about what the process was when they became adults, how they would, what the process was for having them leave if they wanted to, or were they, at
like were they transitioned from one place?
Yeah, I guess that's it, the transition. What was the transition process?
Yeah.
In terms of the camp of stay,
the convent where they were.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry?
When the children would time out, like what transition, what occurred then? So
they did not accept adults. They had a limit. I think it was between 19, I think was ages were not, they understood that children for the most part lied about their ages in order to be able to work. So they said they were older, but they were actually younger. So, that was part of the issue, but they did not want adults there because the adults, the adult camps were really not very well run and all kinds of issues there. In terms of having the children leave, they tried to have as much of a quick turnover as possible, especially with the younger children, as soon as they could find family members, because they had so many people coming in. after, I would say by 1946, they had less of the younger children and just the teens, where the issue was what country would take them. And that was something that, they talked about in the film. For the most part, Poland, Hungary, they really couldn't go back there. They had, there were anti-Semitic violence for returning someone who tried to go back to their home or just come back to the area. They really had, and there were quotas to go other places. So one of the places that some of the teens went to, especially the teens involved in the communal groups, were Palestine, which is pretty incredible, but they went through the illegal immigration. So from the camps, from Indusdorf, they continued onto a ship that was usually holding way more people, like the Exodus, Leon Uris, that story, way more people than it could have, trying to get into Palestine. And the British then sent them to Cyprus for another internment camp, which is actually what happened to my mother.
Wow.
And then they didn't really get to start a normal life until, if it was Palestine, until the establishment of the state, 48, 47, if they were able, sometimes the British allowed them to come in. My mother was allowed to come in from Cyprus because of the Queen's birthday in 1947. She was allowed to come in. As a present, they allowed 500 children from the Cyprus internment camps. But, it just depended if they were able to come into America, come into England. It just depended how their situation was in terms of many of them started working and then going to school at night. That seemed to be the process, that they just found a job and would start to attend school at night or just start their own business. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did.
Thank you. Thank you, Miriam. This was excellent. Thank you so very much for
Thank you.
I hope you'll come back and join us another time and share some more of your work. It's fascinating.
Oh, well, I timed it too. I had too much, but that's okay. Thank you so much for asking me.
Absolutely. Have a great Friday, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.